Hi, everyone. Welcome to Trisha's spring programming and the first week of our, and the second week of our series with Rabbanit Leah Sarna, the Torah, What is to Become of It? Of her, sorry. Rabbanit Sarna is the Associate Director of Education and Director of High School Programs at Drisha. She previously served as the Director of Religious Engagement at Anshe Shalom B'nai Israel Congregation in Chicago, a leading urban Orthodox congregation. She was ordained at Yeshivat Mahara in 2018, holds a BA from Yale University in philosophy and psychology, and also trained at the SKA Beit Midrash for Women at Migdal Oz, Drisha, and the Center for Modern Torah Leadership. As always, we encourage you to ask questions either by unmuting yourself or by putting questions in the chat. If you are comfortable doing so, we'd love for you to turn on your camera and actively participate throughout the class. Over to you, Rabbanit Sarna.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So I know some people who are here were able to join us for the last class or made it up. Shout out to Alana, who not only watched the class, but then sent me a question about it, but said I haven't had a chance to respond to you yet. But just as a kind of a reminder about what this project is, so we're tracing a certain question that appears in 3 different places in the Talmud. We'll see. Next week we're going to look at 2 of them, but I think they're the same basically. These 2 like parallels to view next week. And the question is Torah mataha aleha, the Torah, what is to become of her? And last week I kind of explained why I think this is such an important question leading up to Shavuot as we renew our relationship with the Torah every year. And in renewing a relationship, we take responsibility for it. And I think this question is all about responsibility. The Torah, what is to become of it, is a question asked by people who feel a great deal of responsibility for the Torah. Last week, we saw King Yannai ask that question. And then the answer that he gets came from Elazar ben Poira, and he says, what's going to happen to the Torah? Who cares? Roll it up, put it in the corner. Anyone who wants can come and learn it. And that's more or less what King Yannai does. And then there's maybe like a slaughter of the rabbis, or maybe there's a expulsion of the rabbis or something in that direction. There's differences of account between the Talmud and Josephus, as we saw last week. And then the Talmud there says, the crown of the Torah was not renewed until Shimon ben Shattach comes along. Until Shimon ben Shattach, Hechazir atara liyushna, return the crown of the Torah to its former glory. So that's the story we saw last week. And I think it's really important when we're thinking about, what's a good question, that even though you can sometimes have great questions, there's still wrong answers to great questions. And that is something that we definitely saw last week. And the Talmud itself, and even kind of Josephus, takes it in this direction, right? The Talmud itself immediately has this interjection by an Amora into the story. And the Amora says, oh, this is where King Yannai became a heretic, because only a heretic would think, oh, great, the written Torah is the whole Torah. It can be rolled up and put in a corner, right? Because we all know the real Torah is both the written Torah and the oral Torah. The oral Torah is contained inside of the sages, and the sages, if you kill them all, then you're going to lose it. So that's a really big deal. And that indeed, there's a tremendous loss there, and the question is, what is the magnitude of that loss? We don't really know. Perhaps Shimon ben Shattach really was able to kind of fully restore the Torah to its former glory. That's at least as the story goes, but it's not so convincing in my opinion. But I'm sure other people have different reads to that. In any event, today we are going to zoom forward in time, and now we are. The Hasmonean kingship has gone, and we are now in Roman times, and the Romans are potentially coming for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and so Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is who we are going to be looking at today. But before we get to that classic story, I want to offer, based on this framing of our question, which is where we're really going to start. I want to look at some of the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai classic stories through the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai classic story, kind of through the framing of our question of Torah mataha aleha and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's very kind of unique specific approach to that question. So we will start with that, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and as always, people are super welcome to participate by putting things into the chat. If you're watching on Facebook, you can also put things into the chat there, and I think Chaya is gonna monitor that, and Chaya is also gonna share the source sheet. Thank you so much. I should also say, happy Yom HaAtzmaut. Not really anymore. I don't know. It's like Ben Hashmasho, Yom HaAtzmaut, but it's like a funny Yom HaAtzmaut because it was Yom HaAtzmaut on Thursday. Thursday is Yom HaAtzmaut, but also tonight is Hey ER, which is like the typical date of Yom HaAtzmaut. So it's like basically still Yom HaAtzmaut, right? This is actually kind of an interesting text in the context of Yom HaAtzmaut, and I'll flag that when we get to why. Okay, so we're going to start out in Brachot 35b, and we are going to point to a contrast. So to Rabbanan, we have a Breita as he just taught. V'asafta deganacha, you'll gather in your grain. Ma Talmud lomar, what's the meaning of that verse? Lefish ne'amar lo yamush sefer Torah zami picha, because it also says in the book of Yehoshua, lo yamush sefer Torah zami picha, the Torah should not depart from your mouth. And importantly, right, or I guess that part of the verse says it all, but whenever we learn Gemara and the Gemara quotes a pasuk, you got to know what the rest of the pasuk is, because often the Gemara is like just thinks that you have it in your head, so they'll quote like a few words, but it's really like you're supposed to keep going, right? So it's lo yamush sefer Torah zami picha v'gita vo yomam v'layla, and you should contemplate it day and night, says Joshua. So there seems to be a problem, says the Gemara. It's because Yachol Dvarim Kichtava, and you might have thought that the verse in Joshua is meant to be understood literally. You're supposed to study Torah 100% of the time. Okay, but if I'm studying Torah 100% of the time, then when am I supposed to gather in my grain? How am I supposed to do Vasafta Deganacha if I'm studying Torah 100% of the time? Now, this is like a very resonant question for people who both want to study Torah and want to eat, which is, I think, everyone more or less. So, so unless you have a kollel where you get paid to learn, and really I'm not bashing kollels. I love a good kollel. Drisha has a couple coming up this summer. I spent 5 years of my life learning full time, paid for by others, a couple years by my parents, a couple years by the Wexner Fellowship. Very, very grateful for those years of my life. But at the same time, it's not really a sustainable model, right? At a certain point, you have to do Vasafta Deganacha and learn Torah and keep the Torah going on in your life, right? And that's maybe a model that we're offering right now, where maybe you went to work today and maybe now you're learning Torah in the evening. How fantastic. But in any event, here's the response put forward by the Gemara. So the first answer is by Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael says, "Hanhig behem minhag derech eretz." So technically that means like assume the way of the world, right? So I think Rabbi Ishmael is trying to say like, yeah, like you can't take the verse in Yehoshua so literally, right? You have to assume like what it means, like in the way of the world. But like I think a better translation for Rabbi Ishmael is just like be normal. Like everyone in their life has to balance things. So you also have to balance things. And when you're trying to balance things, just like be a human, be a normal person. And that is, and normal people have to balance, making a living and learning Torah. Rabbi Shimon says, "Hanhig b'hem ninhag derech eretz," balance. Maybe Torah umada, Torah im derech eretz. Maybe this is something that was that was energizing for Rav Hirsch when he suggested a motto of Torah im derech eretz. Okay, fine. So that's Rabbi Yishmael. But along comes Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is nothing if not a very intense person, right? So here's what the intense Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai suggests. Shimon Bar Yochai Omer, Efshar Adam Chorish B'shat Charisha, Zorea B'shat Zriya, Kotzer B'shat Ktsira, Dash B'shat Disha, Zoreh B'shat Haruach, Torah Mataheh Aleha. Is it possible for a person to plow in the plowing season and sow in the sowing season, harvest in the harvesting season, thresh in the threshing season, winnow in the winnowing season? And if all of that is happening, what is going to happen to the Torah? Says Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. What is going to happen to the Torah? Now, when you hear this list, Chorish, Zorea, Kutzer, Dash, Zorah, what is that you can put into the chat? You can unmute. What does that list remind you of?
Lamitet Malachot.
Great. That's like a good chunk of the Sidura Dapat, the section of the 39 prohibited activities on Shabbat that take you from preparing your ground. In that list, you start with planting, but I think Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai makes a little bit more sense to plow before you plant. But anyways, whatever. When we study those Mishnayot together, we can discuss what the ideal order of the 39 malachot should be. But anyways. Right, so the 39 prohibited activities on Shabbat contain the whole order of things from planting all the way through the creation of bread. And here you have most of the way towards the creation of flour. He's kind of missing maybe the next step is like there's borer in the 39 malachot, there's like another type of sorting, and so on and so forth. But in any event, right. So we're going to come back to Shabbat. So I just want you to hold that we had this like subtle Shabbos reference here from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and we're going to come back to that Shabbat reference. And then obviously what I'm the most interested in is this question. If you're doing all that work, Torah Mataheh, you are working in your field all year round, what is going to happen to the Torah if you are working in your field all year round? Which means, right, that for those of us who worked a full day today, and now we're here learning Torah, what does Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai think of our Torah? Right? He's not into this model. He says the Torah cannot be sustained by people like us who work all day and learn Torah at night. Torah Mataheh if you are working around the calendar. So what's his solution though? Because there has to be a solution, not only because humans have to eat, that's maybe one piece of the equation, but also the Torah says that you're going to bring in your grain. So it's not even, so the grain has to come in, right? There's a promise, right? Ozzy says, how about the phrase, Yimin Kemach in Torah? Let me tell you something, that phrase is not by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Right? What if there's no flour, there's no Torah? And we're gonna see, right? We're gonna follow Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai into a journey in which there is no flour in said journey. So hold tight, because he definitely thinks there's plenty of Torah in a place where there is zero flour. Okay. Torah Mataheh, if you cannot study Torah as your main job, right? So, but how do you resolve the pasuk from Kriyat Shema V'asafta Deganecha? Here's the answer: Ela bizman sheYisrael osin ratzono shel makom. Rather, when a time that the Jewish people are doing what God wants from them, melachtan naaseh al yedei achirim. Their work will be performed by others. Shneimar v'amdu zarim v'ra'u tzona'achem. Right, Isaiah 6, strangers will stand and they will feed your flocks, foreigners will be your plowmen and your vine dressers. And at a time when the Jewish people are not doing what God wants from them, they have to do their own work. And so, right, fascinating reread of the pasuk. You'll bring in your own grain. How does he read it? Not as like some kind of promise, your grain has to come in. It's a curse, says Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. You're not doing what God wants from you, and now you have to bring in your own grain. if you're doing what God wants from you, and more than that, right? What does he pair Vasafta Ganacha with? Below Od Elisha Malachet Achirin Nasid Al Yadan Shnamar Vavadata Doivacha. As it says in Devarim, and this is really from the curses part, you shall serve your enemy whom God shall set against you in hunger and thirst and nakedness, and in want of all things. And he taught, so what's happening here? Tying in Masafta de Ganacha to the other curses of Devarim. Crazy read. Right, so in the ideal world, when the Jewish people are doing what God wants from them, they're keeping mitzvot, they're learning Torah, what happens? Everything is done for them. Malachta nasi al yedei achirin, and that is how the Torah gets preserved, right? Torah mata halal. The answer is you study Torah and you'll be taken care of. That's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's vision. Some Kabbalists say that the Gentiles will be willing slaves when Mashiach comes. For sure, you don't even need to be such a Kabbalist. I was at a talk by Professor Michael Wishegrad. This is kind of in the twilight of his life, Michael Wishegrad alav shalom, and this was kind of his messianic vision also, that the Gentiles will work the land for us. There's like a complicated piece of this vision, right? Which is that in Israel today, there's all sorts of problems. Like the dairy industry has a problem, right? Because like cows have to get milked on Shabbos. You can't not milk your cow on Shabbos. And so like how are you supposed to do that? And what most of the Israeli dairy industry does is actually employ Gentiles to facilitate the milking on Shabbos. And there's all sorts of other things that they do also, because having a Gentile do a Torah level violation of Shabbos on your behalf is not so straightforward. So like what actually can happen with the milk? Like would you actually be able to sell the milk if a Gentile did it? Blah, 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 all sorts of things. But like the modern state of Israel in a certain sense relies on Gentiles for a significant part of its economy. That's really interesting, right? And so if you're Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, you're like, yeah, have them milk every day of the week. Why are you just having them do Shabbos? Have the Gentiles work all the time? And the answer is like, well, you have to pay the Gentiles. But as Ozzy's saying, right, like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai would say, no, ideally they're your willing slaves or something like that, right? But this question of like malachta nasid al yedei achirim is a little bit of a challenge with the Zionist vision of even the people in jail should be Jews, the robbers should be Jews, and the policemen should also be Jews, and the everything. And then all of a sudden you have you run into some problems. Then it's like, oh yeah, actually maybe we are codependent on Gentiles in a way that maybe in our vision of the Jewish state we weren't exactly. And then you see different halachic thinkers having that influence their solutions in different ways, because some would say, no, we can't only put forward halachic solutions that rely on Gentiles. And others would say, okay, but there are Gentiles here, and that's obviously the easiest halachic solution. So maybe we should do that. And so please out, just like in whatever, if you're interested in like the overlap between the Israeli economy and really interesting halachic questions, there's a lifetime's worth of literature for you to look at, and this is just that. But one of the driving forces is in that conversation is exactly this. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai would say, "Malachta nasid al yedei achirim." Their work is done by others. Ideal. And other Zionist thinkers would say, modern Zionist thinkers would say, no, in the modern state of Israel, everything should be done by Jews, and that's the ideal. So anyways, just to have a little bit of Yom HaAtzmaut Torah on our Yom HaAtzmaut Ben HaShmashot, I thought I'd like bring that in as kind of an aside. Oh, someone else is saying things. Right, so Debbie says, okay, but what about 6 days a week you should work? Right, okay. You don't have to like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's approach here. And in fact, the Gemara itself doesn't. So let's keep going. Debbie says, yeah, 6 days you should work. If 6 days you should work, then that presumably means don't just learn Torah 6 days. There's I'm sidetracked and telling you stories, right? Like the classic joke is like, how does how does a Gush boy celebrate Shabbos? He takes the pen out of his pocket. And that's like, right, like what does it mean that like you do the same thing on Shabbos that you do on the weekday? And there's a certain complexity to that, because Shabbos is actually supposed to be different than the weekday, and if it's not different, then like maybe you're doing something wrong. Sarah Wolkenfeld and I tried to like get at that question in a class we previously taught for Drisha this year, so you can definitely check that out if you're interested in more content in that direction. Okay, so now we've been introduced to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's question of Torah Mataheh Aleha, and he says if you have a career and you're not just learning Torah all the time, Torah Mataheh Aleha. What is going to happen to the Torah? The Torah needs people to study her full time. Okay. I want you to keep that thesis in mind. We're going to keep going in this Gemara here because it's fantastic and you should see it. But we're going to return to that very strongly because we're going to read the Rabbi Ishmael in the cave narrative through this philosophical lens of Torah Mataheh Aleha if I have to work the ground. Okay. So that's the project today, but we're going to keep going here because now we're going to see later generations, right? That was Tanaim. Now we're going to bump forward to Amoraim, and they're going to have like an evaluative conversation about the debate between Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Okay, good. Debbie says, does he think it's for everyone? Good. I think the cave is going to really help you get a sense of that. And then we're going to look at the cave, then we're going to look at a short Gemara from Masachet Sukkah, and then we're going to look at a Maharsha that tries to draw all three together, and the Maharsha is going to exactly try and answer your question based on the Gemara and Sukkah. So I'm going to hold off on the question of does Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai think that learning Torah and not working is for everyone? But I would say that if you were just looking at this text, B'sha'ashi Yisrael usin ritzono shel makom, seems like it's about the whole community, right? The time when the Jewish people are doing what God wants from them, their work is done by other people, freeing them to learn Torah full time, does seem like that is a vision that is for everyone. Okay, so here's the evaluative conversation. It's fantastic. Amar Abaye says, Harbe asuk Rabbi Ishmael v'al tabi adan. Abaye says lots of people did like Rabbi Ishmael suggests, right? And Rabbi Ishmael's suggestion again was like just a few words long. Hanheg behem minhag derech eretz. Be normal, says Rabbi Ishmael. Abaye says lots of people were normal, v'al tabi adan, and it worked out for them. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, they tried to do like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that Lo Altavi Adan, and it didn't work out for them. So that is a biased perspective. Amar Lahu Rava le Rabbanan. So Rava, Abaye's Bar Pluta, Abaye's frequent interlocutor, says to the rabbis, but here it's like in his yeshiva where he's in charge. So it's like the rabbis here presumably mean like his students. His practice was to say to them, please, I implore you, Nisan Tishrei lo tichazu kamai. During the months of Nisan and Tishrei, do not appear before me, so that you will not be preoccupied with your sustenance all year. So this is interesting because at first glance, it seems like Rava is agreeing with Abaye. It seems like Abaye says, yes, be normal, figure out how to balance it. And then you have Rava's approach of, 2 months a year, you're going to have to go actually do work in Nisan and in Tishrei. And then that'll free you up the rest of the year to learn Torah. Okay, but if you dig into Rava's example, what kind of farmer only farms 2 months of the year? Not one who is doing Chorish Bashat Harisha, Zorea Bashat Zoria, right? It's not someone who's doing the type of farming that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is suggesting. Okay, Ozzy says it's a lazy farmer. Could be a lazy farmer. Could be a farmer who is a a gentleman farmer, a wealthy farmer who owns a lot of land and employs a lot of people or owns a lot of slaves who, right, and Jews were slave owners to the best of our knowledge in Bavel. And the Gemara describes Jews being slave owners in Bavel. Yeah, Debbie.
You don't have many days in Tishrei. And
Yeah, right.
And it's the harvest, like the work is done.
Right, exactly. So what does it mean to go home in Tishrei? It means go home, celebrate the harvest that all these other people accomplished for you, and count your coins. Basically, that's what you're doing in Tishrei. You're saying, "Oh, this guys, everyone, great work! Look at how much stuff we brought in. Amazing! Let's celebrate a sukkah together, right?" But you were away in yeshiva all summer, so so you didn't actually do the plowing and the planting and the right? You're just coming home to say, and in Nisan, when you're doing that first round of harvest, and right, the first things are starting to come up, and maybe you're planting. So yeah, I mean, you're there to oversee the highlights in Nisan and in Tishrei, the beginning and the end of the season. And you're not there the rest of the time. So there's a lot of potential ways to read that, right? One way to read it would be, yeah, actually Torah is just for the wealthy. And in Rava's world, Torah is something that you need to have, basically you need to have siblings who are doing it for you, who are actually overseeing it, or you have foremen who are doing it for you and overseeing it. You have to have a whole support system, or people who you pay to support you, in order for you to really learn Torah. And then, if for you to feel confident about it, or when the extra hands are really needed in 2 months of the year, you'll go home. But no one is running a farm 2 months of the year. You know what happened? If you planted in Nisan and didn't show up again until Tishrei, you would not have a harvest. That is what would happen. So two potential reads of Rava, right? One read is, yeah, Rava just says yeshiva is for wealthy people. Ultimately, malachta nasit al yedei acherim, basically, right? It seems like he's agreeing with Abaye, but it doesn't really. The words he's saying don't, like, structurally, it feels like he's going to agree with Abaye, but the words he suggests don't come out agreeing with Abaye. They're really much more Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but they're not this vision, this communitarian vision of like, we all do mitzvot so much and then Hashem takes care of us. They're much more, Torah is just for the people who can afford it. Right? So it's like this a little bit like twisted vision of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And another version is the farmer who's just really bad at farming and like doesn't bring in very much of a harvest and is really in yeshiva full time and then starves mostly through the winter, or harvests stuff that grow on trees only and lives on that. And that's the impoverished version, but it's still a Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai version, right? So it's just whether you're a wealthy Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai or a poor Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, this is not someone who is attending to every level of the agricultural needs of their land at every stage version coming from Rava. But you have Abaye saying Rabbi Yishmael's version is better. So maybe what you're seeing is a debate between Abaye and Rava here. Okay, so here's Rabbi Bar Chana. He says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So this is maybe more like a Eretz Yisrael kind of discussion of this, right? Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Eli. Come and see that the later generations are not like the earlier generations, that the earlier generations were so much better. The earlier generations, what they scheduled their lives around was learning Torah all the time, and they did their work in the gaps between the Torah, and it worked. But in the later generations, when they made their work the real thing, and their Torah, they just fit in between the gaps. And actually, like, that didn't work out for anyone. So there's this nostalgia for a time We don't know when that time was. Dorot Harishonim, the earlier generations, when people really could just like fit their work in around their Torah schedule. But a sense that in our times, in the times of who's the speaker, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Eli, it's already not possible to do that. And already you can try, you have to prioritize your career. And even when you're prioritizing your career doesn't really go anywhere and your Torah doesn't really go anywhere. Says Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Eli. These are very sad times indeed. But maybe there's something like extremely relatable about this idea that like, I prioritize my career and then I can barely learn the amount of Torah I want to learn, and really neither of them are going anywhere. I feel like that's like a very, there's probably a lot of people out there who feel that way. I hope a lot of people don't. Maybe we can all strive also to, at least at some time in our life, put our Torah first and our career second. And there certainly are people in the world who do that for their whole lives, and that's obviously very amazing. But I just love, I love teaching this. And the truth is that this is actually like the transition to what happens next in the Gemara, where there's like a whole list of other things that the earlier generations were better at, and later generations were worse at. But I just feel like this is like so relatable that I wanted to bring it in and show it to you. Okay. So now we are going to transition to a very well-known story that you have probably learned any number of times in any number of contexts. But I think that looking at this story through the statement of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in Brachot, where he says, if you're working the land, there's a fundamental, profound conflict between agriculture and Torah. If we want to plumb that contrast between agriculture and Torah, and that contradiction between agriculture and Torah through this story, there's a lot of really interesting things that come out. So I'm not going to teach it as if you've like never heard the story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the cave before. Though of course, if you have not, welcome. I'm so excited for you that you're learning it today. But at the same time, if you're like, oh, this story again, I want to say that I think looking at it through this perspective is really generative. So that's, I guess, what I want to just introduce. But we'll move through it a little bit quickly, and I'll just point out the parts of it that I think really get to this question of like the contrast between having to eat and agriculture and Torah study. Okay. So I skipped the whole beginning of the story. How did they even get to the cave? Why? The answer is like they're running away from the Romans. First, they go and hide in the Beit Midrash, and his wife was bringing them food, but they distrust her, and so they run away and they think she's gonna maybe accidentally let slip where they are or whatever. So they have to leave the Beit Midrash to go hide again. And here's what happens: Azlu Tashu Marata, they go and they hide in a cave. Yidrachish Nisa, a miracle occurs. Ibrelu Charuva ve'ena demaya. So a carob tree was created for them, as well as a spring of water. So to go back to Ozzy's question of in Kamach in Torah, how can there be Torah without flour? Well, here's Torah with just a carob tree and water. So I would say Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai thinks there can be Torah without any Kamach whatsoever. And yet at the same time, right, a miracle happened for them, that they were able to survive, they were able to live and to study Torah, even though they were not doing any agricultural work at all. The land, in this case, the malachta naset al yedei acherim, their work's being done by others. Who are the others? They're this miraculous tree and this miraculous spring of water. Ozzy says, oh, you're not supposed to rely on miracles. Well, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai did, or else he wouldn't have run away to the cave at all, because then he would have just died there. And it worked out for him. So he would say, seems like relying on miracles is okay. But yes, I agree. I would not recommend. I'm on team Abaye of people have tried this before and it has not worked out for them. Okay, anyways, right? Okay, so there's a carob tree, there's water. Havu mashluchi minaihu v'havu yatve ad tavaraihu bechala. So they would remove their clothes, manaihu are clothes, and they would sit up to their necks in sand. Okay, so just to imagine that visual of you walk into a cave. Imagine you stumble across Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son, and you come into a cave, and it's just a head floating on top of the sand. That's what you're meant to be seeing here, right? If anyone studied philosophy and you've learned about like brain in vat theories, I think that's more or less what you're visualizing here. Like, come in and what body? I don't have a body. I don't need a body. My body just gets in the way of my Torah study. That's more or less the argument of Torah Mataha Aleha. I don't want, of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's Torah Mataha Aleha. I don't want to have to eat. Someone else should take care of my body. I just want to learn Torah all the time. And here, that's exactly what's happening, right? He has just enough. He's on this like soylent diet of carob and water. And where is his body? And then the visual really comes to back it up, right? Where is my body? It's being taken care of by this carob in this tree, and otherwise, all you can see of me is my head above the sand. Okay, right, so they're up to their necks in sand. Kule Yoma Garse, and what are they doing? All day long, they're learning. And sometimes, in addition to learning, you also have to daven. How unfortunate. But Idan Zluye was when it's time to daven. Lav She Michsayu, they would dress. Matzlu, and they would daven. V'hadar Mashalchi Minayu Kehechi Delo. And otherwise, they would take their clothes back off so that their clothes would stay in good condition. Because you need your clothes in order to daven, so you gotta take them off and on in order to protect them. That's I think the idea, right? Oh, this is a great point, right? And this language of livlu, right? Their clothes did not balu, is very much one of the miracles described in the Gemara about the desert. And in the desert, their clothes did not get destroyed. And Ozzy points out, right? So they rely on some miracles. They rely on miracles that their bodies will survive, but they don't rely on those same miracles, right? Like the man, let's say. They relied on the miracle of the man in the form of carob and water, but they did not rely on the miracle of their clothing surviving. So we're not quite at that level, maybe, but we're like one level below. Debbie, what were you going to say?
No, it reminded me very much of the supernatural existence in the desert.
Absolutely.
They're having an existence of their minds. That's what they're focusing on.
100%. Yeah, and I think, but in the desert, it like never really succeeded because they're always complaining about being hungry, wanting meat, blah, blah, blah. For Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, like went all in. And I think the sand also is meant to kind of give you that desert feel too. I think that's definitely a piece of it. Okay, but then it's time to leave. So Ata Eliyahu Bakama Picha Demarta. So Elijah the prophet comes, stands at the entrance to the cave. Amar Man Lo De'ela Bar Yochai Demeit Kesar Uvatil Gezerte. And he stands. So Elijah stands at the entrance to the cave. Says, "Who will inform Bar Yochai that the emperor has died and his decree has been nullified?" So they hear Eliyahu say that, and then nafkus, they go out. What happens the minute they go out? Chazu inshe deka karve vizare. They come out of the cave and they see people plowing and sowing, right? So what's going to happen to the Torah? If people are plowing and sowing, what's going to happen to the Torah? And exactly, we were sitting in our cave, we were taken care of, we were living this ideal, all brain, all Torah lifestyle. And the minute we go out, we see people plowing and sowing, all this terrible stuff. Amrin, and they said, these people, they have abandoned the eternal life of Torah study, and now they're engaging in this temporal chayesha life in this world. What are they doing? What a terrible mistake. And they were so angry that every place they directed their eyes was immediately burned. So, right, if we set up as this contrast, if people plow and people plant, what's going to happen to the Torah, says Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. That is like the animating anger now of like, yeah, these people are plowing and planting. They're destroying the Torah. So to Debbie's original question of maybe this isn't for everyone, here clearly they think it ought to be for everyone. And anyone who's not doing it because they just had proof of concept, right? Proof of concept, you leave behind all this stuff, go sit in a cave by yourself up to here and you'll be taken care of. We proved that it can work. How could anyone not live this lifestyle that we just proved could exist? How could anyone choose against it? And then burn them up, says Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Okay. But what happens now? Yatsa bat kol va'amar lahem, a divine voice. So before we had Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, before we had Eliyahu Hanavi, but all the people who communicate between God and man, I feel like, are making appearances in the story. So now we have a bat kol, divine voice emerges, Amar lahen, and says to them, Lahachriv olami yatsatem, you emerged from the cave in order to destroy my world. Okay. I'm gonna pause here for a second and just say, right? So Rabbi Shimon, last week we saw Yannai asking good question, wrong answer, Torah scholars die. What do we think so far of the question here again? Good question, wrong answer, because that answer is leading to Lahachriv olami yatsatem. You have a bat kol herself criticizing their answer to the question, right? The answer to the question is, right, that if, like, what kind of responsibility do I need to take for the Torah? Oh, I know I have to leave behind agriculture and everyone else needs to do it with me. And if they don't do it with me, I'm going to burn them alive. The Bakul says, absolutely not. Terrible answer. Back to the cave with you. It says, the Bakul, chizru l'ma'arachem, may go back to their cave. Ozzy, you're all about the not relying on things. Oh, you can't rely on miracles. You can't rely on a bakul. All right, I hear you. I wouldn't rely on the bakul either. But in this case, I think the bakul kind of saved the world. So maybe that's a good bakul. But if you hear a bakul, definitely, ask yourself some questions first. Oh, this is great. Alana says there's wordplay between the charuv that they ate, the carob that they ate, and then being machriv, the world. That's very good, shkayach, that they are destroying, but it's the same word. And that maybe that, right, to take it like to the next step, that the ability to eat that charuv and the knowledge that they have of, I can sit here and there will be this like miraculous carob that's going to take care of me, that actually is almost like that idea is machriv, that proof of concept that I can separate out my mind from my body or my Torah from my ability to eat and work the land, is a destructive concept that the carob in a way enabled, that then caused them to be machriv. So I like that so very much. Good job. Okay, so they go back to the cave. So Hadur Azlu, the Azul, they go back to the cave. Yatvu Tresar Yarche Shata, they sit for 12 months. And then they kind of argue their case because they're unhappy in the cave. Amre, Mishpat Rishim Begehenom Shnei Masar Chodesh. They say the judgment of the wicked in Gehenom is only 12 months. Let us out, please. Yatsa Bat Kol Va'amra, so the Bat Kol says, fair enough. Tzu'umi Marachem, go out from your cave. Nafku, they go out. And it's kind of the same thing, but they don't want to get stuck back in the cave. So Kol Hicha Dahave Machi Rabbi Elazar, Hava Maseh Rabbi Shimon. So anywhere that Rabbi Elazar would try and like destroy with his eyes, Rabbi Shimon would be like, I don't want to go back to the cave. And so he would just heal it. So they would destroy and heal, destroy and heal, destroy and heal. Amar Lo, and he would try and like calm his son down, right? So before it was everyone needs to be like us. Now he's changing his tune. Amar Lo, Bani Dai Le'olam Ani Ve'ata. You and I are sufficient. Maybe we're the only people who can live this extremist vision of how to protect the Torah, but it's enough. If there's two people, the Torah, it seems like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai still thinks his answer is correct in the sense that the Torah requires people to be learning it around the clock at all times with their full intensity. But what is sufficient for the world and for Torah to be learned? Just me and you were enough to preserve the Torah in this world. So it's almost like that same answer of like, put the Torah in the corner and it'll be fine. Similarly here, put the Torah in me and you and it will be fine, right? You could say like all the problems of put the Torah in the corner maybe are different when it's humans because you still have the Torah Shebaal Peh. Maybe here you only have the Torah Shebaal Peh. That's kind of like an intriguing option. The Torah Shebechtav is like a little bit far off. And indeed, when we were talking about Torah Shebechtav, that radical reread of Devarim of Vasafta Deganecha is actually a curse. Right? It seems like, yeah, maybe actually like this is the Torah. The Torah sits between here and here. The Torah sits between like the top of my head and my chin, like, right? So if the Yannai story is like a radical push towards Torah Shebechtav, you could definitely see this version as a radical push towards Torah Shebaal Peh, and that like nothing can be preserved outside of people studying Torah all the time. So again, what's going to protect the Torah? People studying Torah all the time, or it's fine, it's written, it's over there, but an extreme in either direction is what we're seeing in these two stories. But what happens? So already we're seeing a shift, right? First it was burn everyone. Now it's don't burn everyone because we're sufficient. And now we're going to see a next step in the story. So Bahade Panya Demai Shabbata, the sun is setting on Shabbos afternoon. Chazu Hahu Saba Davenake Tre Medane Asa Barahit Bina Shmasho. You see, elderly man, he's holding 2 bunches of hadassim, 2 bunches of myrtle, and he is running at twilight. Amrulay, they interrupt his Erev Shabbos twilight myrtle run. They interrupt him. They say, Hane Lamalach, why are you holding myrtle? Amar Lahu Lechavod Shabbos. He says back, I'm holding these 2 myrtles for the purposes of Shabbos. Mitzisagi Lechav Echad. Why do you have 2? 1 should be sufficient. And he says very nicely, Chad Keneged Zachor, V'chad Keneged Shamor. 1 for remember the Shabbos day, and 1 for observe the Shabbos day, right? Similar maybe to like why we light 2 Shabbos candles, 1 for Shamor, 1 for Zachor. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai sees this and he says, Amar le'levrei, Chaze kama chavivin mitzvot al Yisrael. See how beloved the mitzvot are to Israel. And notice, right, it's agricultural. This guy is holding plants. I think the plants are not an accident, right? There's a person using his plants, using the stuff that he grew from the ground to celebrate Shabbat. And that, wow, Kama chavivin mitzvot al Yisrael, how beloved are mitzvot to Israel. Their minds were put at ease. Because all of a sudden we've seen that agriculture is not in this like conflict with Torah. Really, agriculture can serve Torah, right? So that finally settles their mind. But the story does not end there. And the story doesn't end where we're going to leave it off either. But one other thing, right? Because if I cut it off there, I think that would be like such a nice, like, wow, they really learned their lesson. Shkayach. That's not where the story goes. So I just want to show you this next piece a little bit. This is very sad and hard. This piece of the story, amongst others. But here's where we really start to see. Okay, we saw them up to here in sand. La la la. I'm trying to just be a brain. Who cares about my body anyways? But now we're revisiting their bodies, and it's about to get a little, it's already crazy intense, but it's going to get intense about the body for a second. So Shama Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair Chatznai Benafak La'ate. So Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, the son-in-law, heard that they had come out of their cave and that they were free and they didn't have to flee the Caesar anymore, fine, all that stuff, comes out to greet him. He brings him to the bathhouse, and he starts to tend to his father-in-law's flesh. And he sees that Rabbi Shimon has cracks in his skin, and he starts crying, and tears fall from his eyes, and the tears, because the tears are salty, so when he cries on the cracked skin, that really hurts, and he causes his father-in-law pain. Amar lo, when Rabbi Pinchas says to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, oh my gosh, what happened to you? I'm so sad that I had to see you like this. Amar lo, but this is where we see that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, maybe the lesson he learned is not so clear. Amar lo, ashracha shereitani v'kach. No, you should be happy that you're seeing me with my whole body in tatters. Because if you didn't see me with my destroyed body, lo matzata bikach, you wouldn't see me like this. You wouldn't have found me like this, right? So it was worth, he basically is saying it was worth the sacrifice of my body for what I have become in this time. And what does that mean? The Meikara ki have makshe Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai kushia, because originally Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai would ask a question. Hava mefarik lai Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair tresar peruke, and then Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair would respond to the question with 12 answers. L'sof, but when he comes out of the cave, ki have makshe Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair kushia, when Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair would raise a question, mefarik lai Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai esrin va'arba'a peruke. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai would respond to him with 24 answers. He says it was worth destroying my body so that I could learn Torah in this way, so that I could be transformed. While I was only focusing on this, yeah, it's okay, my body is destroyed, it's very, very painful, all of that, I don't care. It's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, because I am now just totally extraordinary in Torah. And if you count, right, it's like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, it's not just that, oh, now I'm 24, because he started out at like a deficit of 12. And so it's really, he's now at like, went from negative 12 to positive 24, right? If you're like thinking about it on a scale in that way. That's how many like units of Torah he learned or something like that. I'm not entirely sure how to say that right, but I think that's right. It's like 36 units of Torah were learned by me. So just to like wrap that up, right? And I think I hope that looking at this story through that lens of maybe like this kind of like cosmic debate between, or cosmic challenge between agriculture and like eating and the needs of the body vis-a-vis Torah. And like, how does that shake out for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? It seems like he's like, yes, I'm on Team Torah, and that means that my body needs to get destroyed. He sort of sees, oh, look at all these people. They're at least growing things, and they're growing these plants for Shabbos. Like, that's nice. And it seemed like maybe at that time, like, oh yeah, they really learned the lesson. Like, this is not such a cosmic battle. Maybe there can really be both. Maybe, like a very like Rav Soloveitchik, like you're growing stuff and that's Torah also. But then we go right back into focus on like what happened to his body. His body is destroyed and he does not seem to mind, meaning he's in pain, but he says it's good. Okay, hang on one second. Alana says, the account of the man with the myrtle shows that there's a major philosophical difference between Rashbi and Yisrael, right? And the people of Israel. Shimon Bar Yochai clearly values Torah learning over all else, including mitzvot, right? That's a really important point. How could he have kept most of the mitzvot while in the cave? Right? If you're only eating carobs, what are you making hamotzian on Shabbos? All sorts of things. But the man, how did you have lulav and etrog, for example, right? But the man gathering myrtles is engaged in mitzvot, as the Jewish people are. They're engaged in the physical world, and they use the physical world for mitzvot at the expense of Torah learning. Good. I think that's a really, really insightful way to put it. That Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai not only is like the Torah sits between here and here, but also insofar as you need the rest of your body to actually like do mitzvot, he's not really interested in that either, right? It's not mitzvot matahah alehen, it's Torah matahah aleha, and right, and even at the Torah at the expense of mitzvot seems to be what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is suggesting. Okay, Ozzy says, what's more important, mitzvot or Torah learning? I would say Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai would for sure say Torah learning. Is that correct? Right? There's always a question when you read a Talmudic story of like, what does the Talmud think of this story? And I think it is not fully clear here that the Talmud's like, yes, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is awesome, and we definitely have that perspective of Abaye of like, and obviously Rabbi Ishmael saying, this is not okay. We have the bot hole saying, you're destroying people with your eyeballs, go back into your cave, right? That's pretty clear. We have a lot of critiques here of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So I think at the very least, you can say he doesn't win. The question is whether he like full on loses, whether he's here as this like extremist voice for Torah study at the expense of all else, even including mitzvot, as Alana points out, or whether there's maybe more to it than that. Right. So, I mean, I think that that's very much open to interpretation, is like how much does he lose? Interesting that our prayer before Shema says that Torah lengthens our lives, yet our sources say that Torah study is exhausting and shortens your life. That's a very interesting point that you're saying here. It's not clear, like they didn't die in the cave. Did they shorten, or maybe they're just, their skin was in pain. I don't know. They have some kind of like skin affliction or something. Okay, let's look at this Gemara in Sukkah, because I have just like two other really sweet sources on the next page that I do a little bit want to get it to us. So we're gonna look at the Gemara in Sukkah. I'm just gonna tell you what the Maharsha says, but it's here for your perusal. And then we'll look at those next two sources all in the next 4 minutes. It's gonna be awesome. Okay, so Chizkiah says the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Re'iti b'nei Aliyah v'hen mu'atin. I have seen members of the caste of the spiritually prominent. That's how they're translating b'nei Aliyah. Prominent, I think is right. And they are few. Im elef hen, if there's 1,000 of them, ani uvani mehen, I and my son are amongst them. Im me'ahem, and if there are 100 of them, ani uvni mehen, I and my son are amongst them. Im shnayim hem, if there are only 2 of them, ani uvni hen, I and my son are they. Says Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Okay. So right, and this Gemara in Sukkah. If you want to go look at the whole thing, this is the Gemara's discussion of the like 36 righteous people. It's like a really great part of the Gemara. So 10 out of 10 recommend everything we learn and the whole Torah, but also this. Okay, so the Maharsha here, the Maharsha is on the Gemara in Brachot, which is where we started, and he says he really is in favor based on this Gemara in Sukkah, right? The first read of this Gemara in Sukkah is like, who says such a thing about themselves? But the Maharsha reads this Gemara in Sukkah to say he's learning, exactly as Debbie kind of pointed out early on, he's learning that this version of Torah learning is only possible for very, very few people, and possibly only for him and his son. And possibly this vision of, if you plow in the plowing season and plant in the planting season and winnow in the winnowing season, what's going to happen to the Torah? That's really like, maybe by the time he says this, he really has learned like the Torah has to be able to survive otherwise, because this model can only work for us. There's maybe only 2 people ever who this could work for. And so that's the Maharsha's read of like, he actually over time, this is just all one big learning process for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai to come to the conclusion that his position expressed in Brachot is actually not exactly right, and actually could be different from, and could be just completely like not possible for real humans who are embodied and have real needs. Okay, I just want to look at 2 other quick sources, because I do think that this battle between this kind of battle between agriculture and food versus Torah, it does play out in lots of other places. And actually, we're just going to look at the Torah, but the Torah is kind of based on the Yerushalmi. So what this Yerushalmi is this classic line, Lo ninu Shabbatot v'yamim tovim ela la'asok b'hem divrei Torah. The purpose of Shabbos and holidays were given so that one could study Torah. That's like the whole point of Shabbat and Chagim, is that on those days you'll learn Torah. And as we saw from the beginning, right, what is when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai lists out all of his agricultural activities, those are all things that are prohibited on Shabbat. And when you prohibit those activities on Shabbat, what does it leave open opportunity for? Torah study. So if we're going to say, yeah, maybe like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's approach to this cosmic battle between agriculture and Torah study is totally extreme. On the other hand, maybe that's what Shabbos is about. And maybe the answer to that question is Shabbat. And that actually, yeah, agriculture does get in the way of Torah. And that's why we have one day a week when agriculture is put on hold. And on that day, we learn Torah. The Torah brings this amazing Midrash. Everyone just quotes it in the name of the Torah. I would love for it to be earlier than the Torah, but everywhere I found just quotes it in the name of the Torah. The Torah is like 1300s. And he says, and so here's the Midrash that he brings, and we have to see it because it's exactly punked on target. Amra Torah lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Torah says to God, Ribono Shel Olam, God, Master of the Universe, Sheichnasu Yisrael haaretz, when the Jewish people go to the land of Israel, Zaratz lekarmo, v'zaratz l'sadehu. This one he's going to run to his vineyard, and this one he's going to run off to his field. Ve'ani, says the Torah, ve'ani mataha alai. Right? Other people can say Torah mataha alaiha, but here it's the Torah talking. And the Torah here says about herself, ve'ani mataha alai, me. What is to become of me? Says the Torah, right? I'm in conflict with agriculture. Once they start working in agriculture, what's going to happen to me? Says the Torah. Amar la, God says back to her, Yishli zug shani mezaveg lach. I have a partner that I'm setting you up with. The Shabbat Shmo, and Shabbos is his name. I always like to point out here that Shabbos is typically gendered female because Shabbos is a female word. Then you have this like very sweet queer couple of Shabbos and Torah, but the Torah isn't interested in that. So the Torah gender Shabbos masculine here. Right? I have a partner for you that I'm pairing you with, and his name is Shabbos. And why is Shabbos the perfect partner for Torah? Shehem b'telim mimlachtan, because on Shabbos they're not doing their work, v'cholim la'asuk bach, and therefore they can study you. And I have to mention on a Shemitah year that there is plenty of literature, including in the Torah itself with Hakel, but other literature also about how Shemitah, what are you supposed to do when you're not working the land during your Shemitah year? Obviously, you're supposed to spend the time studying Torah. And the Zohar imagines that that they go up to that heavenly academy and they learn Torah with Metatron, both ancient Torah and Chidush Torah, and that's exactly what happens. B'chol Shemitah u'Shemitah. In every single Shemitah, they everyone, maybe all the souls or whatever, go up to the heavenly academy and they learn Torah. Because what's not happening in Shemitah? Planting in the planting season, plowing in the plowing season, and so therefore, what can you do? You can learn Torah. So just to like tie it back in to our subject matter of the Torah, what's to become of her, or in the Torah's voice, me, what is to become of me? On the one hand, we see that there truly is like a problem, right? Like if you're working all the time and you're planting and you're plowing and you're winnowing and you're all this stuff, when are you supposed to learn Torah? Very real problem. And maybe what you do is you learn Torah in the vacuums. You learn Torah on Shabbos, you learn Torah during the Shemitah year. Maybe that's one option. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, don't just learn Torah in the gaps, make more gaps. Everything should be a gap. And that's where it gets to be a real problem. And that's where Rabbi Yishmael comes back at Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and says, just be normal and and figure it out. And then, yeah, it's hard. Life is full of hard balances. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, no, what's going to become of the Torah? Come on, Rabbi Yishmael. And so we saw how that played out like in really complicated ways for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But on the other hand, like he's not totally wrong, right? Like Yannai saying, oh, we'll just leave the Torah in the corner and everything will be fine. We'll kill off all the rabbis. Totally wrong. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai asked the same question and has to really be taught that the answer that he's a proponent of is not a reasonable answer. And yet at the same time, there are reasonable microcosms of his answer, right? Like Shabbos and Shemitah, and that maybe his model of Torah can only be learned when you don't have these obligations is not a crazy model. And so I think we're like inching towards what does it mean to protect the Torah? What does the Torah need in order to survive? We say in one like completely wrong answer, one like problematic answer that maybe like required some re-education. And next week we're going to see what I think is like a really awesome answer. So I've been building up. Okay, thank you all. Sorry that I went a little bit over time, but I hope you can see that I'm really enthusiastic about these texts, and I hope that you are too. Yeah, Chai is gonna tell you how to keep learning with us.
Thank you so much, Rabbanit Sarna. And thank you to everyone who joined us on Zoom, on Risha Live, and on Facebook. We're going to continue with Rabbi Silber's Journey Through Genesis series on Sunday at 10 a.m. And we're going to continue our spring program on Sunday at 8 p.m. with a session from Rabbi Shlomo Zekir called The Scope of Torah, continuing from last week. You can find out more about this class, those classes, and all of our spring programming on our website at drisha.org/classes. Thank you again, Rabbanit Sarna, and hope to see everyone again soon.